The autumn of 1847 brought with it the most violent storms the English coast had witnessed in decades. Along the treacherous cliffs of Cornwall, where ancient castles stood sentinel against the raging Atlantic, the waves crashed with a fury that seemed to echo the tumult brewing within the kingdom itself. Celeste Whitmore pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the servants' quarters, her heart hammering as Lady Margaret's shrill voice pierced through the morning air like a blade. The golden-haired young woman clutched a torn piece of silk, the remnants of what had once been Lady Margaret's most precious evening gown. "You clumsy, worthless creature!" Lady Margaret's face was twisted with rage as she advanced toward Celeste, her jeweled fingers raised threateningly. "Do you have any comprehension of what you've done? This gown was worth more than your miserable family could earn in 5 years." Celeste's green eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to stand straighter. The accident had been just that, an accident. While cleaning the grand chamber, she had caught the gown's delicate fabric on a protruding nail, creating an irreparable tear across the bodice. But explanations meant nothing to Lady Margaret Ashford, the cruel mistress of Thornwick Manor. I can repair it, my lady," Celeste whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, The sharp crack of Lady Margaret's palm against Celeste's cheek echoed through the corridor. Several other servants quickly averted their eyes, knowing that any intervention would only bring Lady Margaret's wrath upon them as well. "Repair it?" Lady Margaret laughed coldly. "You think your peasants' hands can restore what your clumsiness has destroyed? No, girl. You'll work without wages for the next 6 months to pay for this damage, and if I hear so much as a whisper of complaint from you, I'll see that no decent household in all of England will employ you." As Lady Margaret swept away in a rustle of burgundy silk, Celeste sank to her knees on the cold flagstones, her hand pressed to her burning cheek. Around her, the other servants resumed their duties in uncomfortable silence. This was the reality of life at Thornwick Manor, brutality disguised as aristocratic privilege. Celeste had come to work at the manor 3 years ago, after her father's death left her family destitute. Her mother and younger brother depended entirely on the meager wages she sent home to their tiny cottage in the village. Now, with 6 months of unpaid labor stretching before her, she wondered how her family would survive. That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered ominously over the moors, Celeste made her way to the cliff path to collect herbs for the kitchen. The wind whipped her simple brown dress around her legs as she carefully navigated the rocky terrain. Here, away from the suffocating atmosphere of the manor, she could finally breathe. The sight of a lone horseman approaching at breakneck speed along the cliff path made her heart skip. Even from a distance, she could see the rider was a gentleman of obvious wealth and importance. His black stallion was magnificent, his dark coat cut in the finest fashion, but something was wrong. The horse was moving too fast, too recklessly, along the treacherous edge where one false step could mean death. As the rider drew closer, Celeste gasped. Never had she seen a man of such striking beauty. His dark hair flew wildly in the wind, and his face held a desperate intensity that spoke of deep inner torment. This had to be Prince Adrian Blackthorne, the mysterious heir to the Blackthorne dukedom, whose reputation for melancholy and isolation was whispered about in every drawing room in England. Suddenly, the prince's horse reared in terror as lightning split the sky. For one heart-stopping moment, both horse and rider teetered on the very edge of the cliff, suspended between solid ground and the churning sea below. Without thinking, Celeste dropped her herb basket and ran forward, waving her arms and shouting over the thunder, "Your Grace, please step back from the edge." Prince Adrian's piercing blue-grey eyes fixed upon Celeste with startling intensity as he wrestled his stallion back from the precipice. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their gazes locked across the wind-swept moor. The prince's face, she noticed, bore the haunted expression of a man carrying unbearable weight. "Who dares to command a prince?" His voice was deep, cultured, yet edged with bitter amusement as he dismounted with fluid grace. "Do you know who I am, girl?" Celeste curtsied hastily, her cheeks burning. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I am Celeste Whitmore, a servant at Thornwick Manor. I feared for your safety." "My safety?" Adrian's laugh was hollow. "How refreshing to encounter someone who values something I myself hold so cheaply." He studied her with unsettling directness. "You risk much, speaking so boldly to your betters." The accusation stung, but Celeste lifted her chin. "I risk nothing by preventing a tragedy, Your Grace. Life is precious, regardless of one's station." Something flickered in Adrian's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Thornwick Manor, you say? Then you serve under Lady Margaret's tender care." His tone carried unmistakable disdain. "I've heard tales of her management methods." Before Celeste could respond, the thunder of approaching hooves announced the arrival of Lady Margaret herself, accompanied by her nephew, the odious Lord Percival Ashford. Both rode in obvious agitation, their faces flushed with exertion and rage. "Your Grace," Lady Margaret called breathlessly, sliding from her side saddle with practiced elegance. "We've been searching everywhere for you, when word reached us that you'd ridden out in this dreadful weather." Her eyes suddenly fixed upon Celeste, and her expression turned venomous. "What is this creature doing here?" "This creature," Adrian said slowly, "just potentially saved my life." Lord Percival, a weak-chinned man of 30 with predatory eyes, laughed nastily. "Saved your life? Your Grace surely jests. What could a mere servant possibly—" "Enough." Adrian's voice carried the unmistakable authority of royal blood. Miss Whitmore showed both courage and compassion, qualities that appear increasingly rare in polite society. Lady Margaret's face paled at the implied insult, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, Your Grace. However, I fear this girl has neglected her duties to wander about unsupervised. Such behavior cannot be tolerated." Celeste felt her stomach plummet. Lady Margaret's tone promised retribution that would make the morning's humiliation seem gentle by comparison. "Perhaps," Adrian said thoughtfully, "Miss Whitmore might serve better in a different capacity. I find myself in need of assistance with certain matters at Blackthorn Castle." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline, but Celeste knew better than to reach for it too eagerly. "Your Grace is most kind, but I cannot abandon my family's needs." "Your family?" Lady Margaret interjected with false sweetness. "Surely you mean the debts your family owes to this estate, the cottage they occupy, the food they consume, all provided through our generosity?" Celeste's heart sank. She had forgotten, or tried to forget, the series of debts that bound her family to the Ashford estate. Her father's funeral expenses, her brother's medical treatments, the winter when their crops failed. Each kindness had been recorded meticulously in Lady Margaret's ledgers. "I see," Adrian said quietly, his gaze shifting between Lady Margaret's triumphant smirk and Celeste's stricken expression. "How convenient." "Indeed," Lord Percival leered. "The girl knows her place. She's bound to us by more than mere employment, aren't you, my dear?" The way his eyes travelled over Celeste's form made her skin crawl. She had endured months of his unwanted attention, his accidental touches, his whispered suggestions that her family's debts might be forgiven under certain circumstances. Adrian seemed to sense the undercurrent of menace. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I trust Miss Whitmore's obligations are managed with appropriate consideration for her circumstances." "Oh, absolutely," Lady Margaret assured him. "We take excellent care of our people. Don't we, Celeste?" Trapped Celeste nodded miserably. To speak truthfully would only bring worse punishment upon herself and her family. As the storm reached its peak, the small party took shelter in a grove of ancient oaks. There, as rain drummed against the leaves above, Celeste found herself seated across from Prince Adrian, acutely aware of his penetrating gaze. When Lady Margaret and Lord Percival became engrossed in conversation about estate matters, Adrian leaned forward slightly. "Your hands," he said quietly, gesturing to her work-worn fingers. "They tell a different story than your mistress's words." Celeste quickly tucked her hands into her skirts. I don't understand, Your Grace." "I think you understand perfectly." His voice was gentle now, stripped of its earlier hardness. "I've seen enough of the world to recognize both cruelty and its victims." For one dangerous moment, Celeste allowed herself to hope that someone, this beautiful, powerful stranger, might truly see her plight. But hope, she had learned, was a luxury she could not afford. "Your Grace mistakes my situation," she said carefully. "I am content in my current position." Adrian's expression grew troubled, as if he recognized the forced nature of her words. But before he could respond, Lord Percival's voice cut through the rain-muffled air. "Your Grace, perhaps we should discuss the matter that brought you to Cornwall, the proposed marriage alliance with my cousin." The mention of marriage sent an immediate chill through the shelter that had nothing to do with the storm. Prince Adrian's face hardened into an impenetrable mask, while Lady Margaret's eyes lit with calculating interest. Celeste felt her heart constrict painfully, though she told herself she had no right to such feelings. "The marriage alliance," Adrian repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Yes, Lady Evangeline Ashford. Your cousin, I believe, Lord Percival." "Indeed," Lord Percival's enthusiasm was nauseating. "A most advantageous match, Your Grace. My cousin possesses all the refinement and breeding befitting a future princess, not to mention her considerable dowry." Celeste stared at her clasped hands, fighting to keep her expression neutral as her heart shattered. Of course a prince would marry a lady of noble birth. What had she been thinking, allowing herself even a moment's foolish fantasy? Lady Margaret leaned forward eagerly. "Lady Evangeline is currently in London, but she could be here within a fortnight for a formal introduction. She's quite the beauty, Your Grace. Golden hair, porcelain skin, accomplished in all the feminine arts." "How convenient," Adrian said dryly. "And I suppose this paragon of virtue is as eager for this alliance as her family." "Naturally," Lord Percival exclaimed. "What woman wouldn't be honored to bear the Blackthorn name?" A bitter smile played at Adrian's lips. "Indeed, and the Ashford family's financial difficulties would naturally be resolved through such a generous union." The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed what Celeste had long suspected. The Ashfords' wealth was largely facade, maintained through loans and mounting debts. This explained their desperate grasping for advantageous marriages and their cruel exploitation of those in their power. Suddenly, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the grove, followed immediately by a tremendous crash. Through the rain, they could see that lightning had struck an ancient tree near the cliff's edge, sending it toppling toward the churning sea below. "The path!" Celeste cried out in alarm. "The slide will block the main route back to the village." Indeed, the fallen tree had triggered a small landslide that now blocked the safest passage. Lady Margaret went pale. "How will we return to the manor? I cannot possibly navigate the lower path in these conditions." "There's a fisherman's trail," Celeste said hesitantly. "It's treacherous, but it leads to the village. I know the way." Adrian studied her face carefully. "You would guide us, despite the danger to yourself?" "I know every stone of these cliffs, Your Grace. I've walked them since childhood." "Absolutely not," Lord Percival interjected. "We cannot trust our safety to a mere servant girl. We'll wait for the storm to pass." "In this?" Adrian gestured to the darkening sky. "This storm could last through the night, and I have pressing matters that require my attention." What happened next changed everything. As they prepared to leave the shelter, a violent gust of wind caught Celeste's worn shawl, ripping it from her shoulders and sending it flying toward the cliff's edge. Without thinking, she lunged after it. Her family could not afford to replace even such a simple garment. But the rain had made the rocks treacherously slippery. Celeste's foot caught on a loose stone, and she felt herself falling toward the precipice. In that horrifying moment, as the hungry waves seemed to reach up for her, she knew she would die. Strong arms caught her, pulling her back from the brink with such force that they both tumbled backward onto solid ground. She found herself pressed against Prince Adrian's chest, his arms locked around her protectively, both of them breathing hard from the shock. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough with concern as he examined her for injuries. His hands were gentle as they checked for broken bones or bleeding, and Celeste had never felt anything so tender. "No, Your Grace, thank you." She tried to pull away, conscious of the impropriety, but Adrian's arms tightened slightly. "That was incredibly foolish," he said, but his tone held no anger, only relief. "A piece of cloth is not worth your life." "You don't understand," Celeste whispered, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "It was my mother's. It's all I have left of her." Adrian's expression softened completely. "Your mother is... She died last winter. The fever." Celeste's voice broke slightly. "I promised I would take care of my brother, but I can barely manage, and now the shawl is gone too." Something profound shifted in Adrian's face. When he spoke again, his voice was different, warmer, more human. "No, it's not gone." To her amazement, he stood and began making his way carefully toward the cliff's edge. The shawl had caught on a small outcropping of rock just below the rim, fluttering like a captured bird in the wind. "Your Grace, please." Celeste scrambled to her feet. "It's too dangerous." But Adrian was already lowering himself over the edge, his boots finding purchase on the wet stone. For several agonizing minutes, he hung suspended between earth and sky, reaching for the precious fabric. Lady Margaret screamed, Lord Percival shouted warnings, but Adrian paid them no heed. When he finally hauled himself back up, shawl in hand, his expensive coat was torn and muddy, his dark hair plastered to his skull. But his eyes were bright as he placed the worn wool gently around Celeste's shoulders. "There," he said softly, "your mother's memory is safe." As Celeste stared up at this prince who had risked his life for a servant's threadbare shawl, she realized that everything had changed. The careful walls around her heart had crumbled completely, and from the stunned expressions of Lady Margaret and Lord Percival, she understood that they realized it too. A prince did not risk death for a piece of cloth, unless the servant who treasured it had somehow become precious to him as well. The storm was far from over. The return journey to Thornwick Manor became a revelation that neither Celeste nor Adrian could have anticipated. As she guided the party along the treacherous fisherman's path, her intimate knowledge of every twist and hidden danger became apparent. But more than her expertise, it was her quiet courage in the face of genuine peril that commanded Adrian's growing admiration. When Lady Margaret's horse stumbled on the slick stones, Celeste was there instantly, steadying both animal and rider with sure hands. When Lord Percival complained bitterly about the cold and wet, she quietly offered him her own dry handkerchief without a word of reproach. Her natural grace under adversity stood in stark contrast to her supposed better's petulant complaints. "How did you come to know these paths so well?" Adrian asked during a brief rest, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than condescension. "My father was a fisherman before." Celeste paused, glancing nervously at Lady Margaret. "Before his accident, he taught me to read the sea and sky, to find safe passage when others saw only danger." "An accident?" Adrian's tone sharpened. "What manner of accident?" Lady Margaret quickly interjected. "A most unfortunate drowning, Your Grace. The man was reckless, fishing in dangerous weather. We were generous enough to take his family under our protection afterward." But Adrian was watching Celeste's face, noting how she flinched at Lady Margaret's words. "And you've worked at the manor ever since?" "Yes, Your Grace." Celeste's voice was barely above a whisper. She couldn't reveal that her father's accident had occurred while he was desperately trying to catch enough fish to pay the Ashfords' impossibly high rent, or that Lady Margaret had actually increased their family's debt burden after his death, claiming funeral expenses and housing costs. As they finally reached the manor's grounds, Lord Percival made his own disturbing agenda clear. "Your Grace," he said with false joviality, "perhaps you'd care to join me for brandy and cigars. We could discuss the marriage arrangements in more comfortable surroundings." Adrian's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps tomorrow, Lord Percival. This evening I find myself in need of solitude to reflect upon recent experiences." The dismissal was polite, but final. As the party dispersed, Celeste began to retreat toward the servants' entrance, but Adrian's voice stopped her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned, acutely aware of Lady Margaret's sharp attention. "Yes, Your Grace. I trust your accommodations here are adequate." It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. Celeste felt the weight of Lady Margaret's glare like a physical force. "Quite adequate, Your Grace. Thank you for your concern." Adrian studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing every feature. "I'm pleased to hear it. Sleep well, Miss Whitmore." But sleep proved elusive for both of them. In her tiny chamber under the eaves, Celeste lay awake, reliving every moment of their encounter, the strength of his arms when he'd saved her, the gentleness in his voice, the incredible risk he'd taken to retrieve her mother's shawl. No one had ever shown her such kindness, such consideration. Meanwhile, in the grand guest chamber, Adrian paced before the fireplace, his mind in turmoil. He had come to Cornwall to dutifully inspect his prospective bride, to fulfill his obligation, to secure the Blackthorne succession through an advantageous marriage. Instead, he found himself captivated by a servant girl whose courage and compassion put the entire aristocracy to shame. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Lady Evangeline Ashford had arrived earlier than expected, accompanied by a retinue that spoke of both wealth and desperation to impress. Celeste caught only glimpses of the celebrated beauty as she served at breakfast, golden curls perfectly arranged, a gown that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and an air of entitled prettiness that seemed calculated to charm. "Your Grace," Lady Evangeline trilled as she was formally introduced to Adrian, "I'm simply overwhelmed to finally meet the famous Prince Blackthorne. Your reputation for both handsomeness and heroism precedes you." Adrian's response was politely neutral. "Lady Evangeline, I trust your journey from London was comfortable." "Oh, tolerably so, though I confess I'm rather eager to see your famous castle. They say it's the most romantic fortress in all of England." As breakfast progressed, Celeste couldn't help but notice how different Adrian seemed in Lady Evangeline's presence. The warmth she had glimpsed the day before was nowhere to be found. He answered questions with mechanical politeness, showed interest in nothing, and seemed to be performing a role rather than engaging as himself. Lady Evangeline, for her part, appeared to find Adrian's reserve challengingly attractive. She flirted with practiced skill, dropping hints about her accomplishments, her family's connections, and her suitability as a future princess. It was a masterclass in aristocratic courtship, and Celeste felt more invisible than ever. Her invisibility proved useful when she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. While serving tea in the drawing room, she caught fragments of discussion between Lady Margaret and Lord Percival. "The girl has become a distraction," Lady Margaret was saying in low, urgent tones. "Did you see how he looked at her yesterday? We cannot afford such complications." "Easily solved," Lord Percival replied with casual cruelty. "A word to her brother about overdue rent, perhaps a threat of eviction. She'll be so focused on family troubles, she'll have no time for romantic fantasies. Or," Lady Margaret's voice grew calculating, "we could arrange for her to be relocated. I have contacts in the Northern Mills. Hard work, but it would remove her from temptation's path." Celeste's hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the tea service. To be sent to the mills was a fate worse than death. Workers there rarely survived more than a few years in the brutal conditions. That afternoon, as if summoned by her distress, Adrian appeared in the garden where Celeste was gathering late roses. He looked haggard, as though he too had passed a sleepless night. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was formal, but his eyes were troubled. "I wanted to thank you again for yesterday." "There's no need, Your Grace." Celeste kept her gaze fixed on the roses, afraid that looking at him directly would reveal too much. "There is every need." Adrian stepped closer, and she could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to him. "I've been thinking about what you said, about life being precious regardless of station. I wonder, do you truly believe that?" The question seemed to carry deeper meaning. Celeste finally looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "I do, Your Grace. Every soul has value. Every heart can love and suffer and hope. Even a prince's heart?" The question was barely whispered. "Especially a prince's heart," Celeste replied softly, "for it carries not only its own burdens, but the weight of all those who depend upon it." For a moment, the distance between their worlds seemed to disappear entirely. Adrian reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. "Miss Whitmore." "Celeste," he began, then stopped, shaking his head. "This is impossible." "Yes," Celeste agreed quietly, her heart breaking. "It is impossible." 3 days passed in a torment of stolen glances and carefully maintained distance. Lady Evangeline had settled into Thornwick Manor like a conquering army, her presence filling every room with bright chatter and calculated charm. Wedding plans were being discussed openly, with Lady Margaret orchestrating events with the precision of a military campaign. Celeste watched it all from the shadows, serving meals and tending fires while her heart slowly shattered. Adrian had retreated behind a mask of princely duty so complete that she began to wonder if their moments of connection had been merely her imagination. He was polite to Lady Evangeline, attentive to the marriage negotiations and utterly unreachable, but she caught him watching her sometimes, quick, agonized glances when he thought no one else would notice. Those brief moments of connection were both blessing and curse, confirming that she wasn't alone in her suffering while making it infinitely worse. The crisis came on the 4th evening, during what Lady Margaret grandly announced as the formal betrothal celebration. The manor's grandest drawing room had been transformed with flowers and candles, the finest china brought out, and the most distinguished local families invited to witness what everyone assumed would be Prince Adrian's proposal to Lady Evangeline. Celeste served wine to the assembled guests, invisible in her simple black dress and white apron. She tried not to listen as toast after toast was raised to the future royal couple, tried not to watch as Lady Evangeline glowed with anticipated triumph. "Your Grace," Lord Percival announced loudly, clearly having consumed rather too much champagne. "Perhaps now would be an appropriate moment for the question we've all been anticipating?" A hush fell over the room. Lady Evangeline's cheeks pinked becomingly as she lowered her eyes in maidenly expectation. Lady Margaret practically vibrated with excitement. Adrian stood slowly, his face a mask of marble composure. "Indeed, there is something I must say." He moved to the center of the room, commanding every eye. Celeste found herself frozen near the doorway, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "I came to Cornwall with a specific purpose, to honor my family's obligation to secure an advantageous marriage alliance. Lady Evangeline's smile was radiant. Lady Margaret nodded approvingly. However, Adrian continued, and something in his tone made Celeste's breath catch, recent events have caused me to reconsider not merely this alliance, but the entire foundation upon which such arrangements are built. The room's atmosphere shifted subtly. Lady Margaret's smile faltered. I have seen courage where I expected servility. Adrian's voice grew stronger, more certain. I have witnessed compassion where I encountered only calculation. I have discovered that true nobility has nothing to do with bloodlines or bank accounts, and everything to do with the content of one's character. A murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Lady Evangeline's face had gone pale. Therefore, Adrian said, his gaze sweeping the room and finally, devastatingly, coming to rest on Celeste, I must decline the honor of Lady Evangeline's hand. My heart, it seems, has already been given to another. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Lady Margaret's voice cut through it like a blade. Your Grace surely jests. Your heart given to whom? Adrian's eyes never left Celeste's face. To a woman whose worth cannot be measured in dowries or bloodlines. A woman who risked her life to save a stranger, who faces adversity with grace, and who has shown me what true love means. Lord Percival sputtered in outrage. Your Grace, this is madness. You cannot possibly mean to— I mean, Adrian said firmly, to ask Miss Celeste Whitmore if she will do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife. The wineglass slipped from Celeste's numb fingers, shattering on the floor in a spray of crystal and burgundy liquid. The sound seemed to break the spell holding the room in silence. This is preposterous, Lady Margaret shrieked, her careful composure finally cracking. You would throw away your royal heritage for a servant? A girl with debts and obligations that bind her to this estate? What debts? Adrian's voice was dangerously quiet. Too late, Lady Margaret realized her mistake. In her fury, she had revealed the trap they had woven around Celeste's family. The legitimate debts incurred by her family, Lady Margaret stammered, but her face betrayed her awareness that she had overplayed her hand. I see. Adrian's tone could have frozen hellfire. And these debts, I assume, are documented with proper legal authority? Lord Percival, sensing disaster, attempted damage control. Your Grace, surely a man of your position cannot seriously consider marriage to someone so unsuitable. Think of your reputation, your family's legacy. My family's legacy, Adrian replied with Arctic precision, will be far better served by a wife of genuine character than by a marriage born of financial desperation and social climbing. Lady Evangeline finally found her voice, though it shook with humiliation and rage. How dare you humiliate me in front of all these people for the sake of that creature, Adrian said, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority, has more true nobility in her smallest finger than this entire room possesses collectively. He strode across the room to where Celeste stood frozen in shock, taking her trembling hands in his strong ones. Celeste, he said softly, his voice meant for her ears alone, though the entire room strained to hear. I know this is sudden, perhaps overwhelming. I know the obstacles seem insurmountable, but I also know that I would rather face a lifetime of struggle with you than an eternity of emptiness without you. Tears streamed down Celeste's face as she stared up at this incredible man who was willing to sacrifice everything for her. Your Grace, Adrian, Say yes, he whispered urgently. Say yes, and let them deal with the consequences. Before Celeste could respond, Lady Margaret played her final desperate card. Guards, she shrieked toward the doorway. Seize this girl, she's stolen jewelry from my personal collection. Two burly footmen moved forward uncertainly, clearly uncomfortable with the accusation but bound to obey their employer's commands. Is that your game? Adrian's voice was deadly quiet as he stepped protectively in front of Celeste. False accusations to remove an inconvenient obstacle? Search her quarters, Lady Margaret demanded, her voice shrill with desperation. You'll find my emerald brooch among her possessions, I guarantee it. The implication was clear. The brooch had been planted as evidence. It was an old trick, and one that would see Celeste transported to the colonies at best, hanged at worst. Adrian's face went utterly cold. When he spoke, it was with the full authority of his royal blood. I suggest you reconsider that accusation very carefully, Lady Margaret, for if you proceed with this charade, you will find yourself answering not only to me, but to the Crown itself for attempted fraud and conspiracy. The room held its collective breath as two powers faced off, old money desperation against royal authority, and in the balance hung not just Celeste's freedom, but the future of them all. The confrontation in Thornwick Manor's drawing room had reached a moment of absolute crisis. Lady Margaret stood frozen, her face cycling through shades of fury, fear and calculation, as she realized the trap she had inadvertently sprung on herself. The assembled guests watched in fascinated horror as their evening's entertainment transformed into a royal scandal. Prince Adrian's declaration hung in the air like a sword. His willingness to invoke crown authority against the false accusations meant that Lady Margaret faced not merely social embarrassment, but potential charges of fraud against a member of the royal family. "Your Grace," Lord Percival attempted weakly, sweat beading on his pallid forehead, "surely there's been some misunderstanding. My aunt would never..." "Would never what?" Adrian's voice cut through the excuse like ice. "Would never conspire to frame an innocent woman. Would never attempt to destroy a life to preserve her own schemes." His gaze swept the room with withering contempt. "I'm afraid my observations suggest otherwise." Lady Evangeline, her dreams of a royal marriage crumbling, tried one last desperate appeal. "Your Grace, please reconsider. This infatuation cannot be real. Surely you see that this girl has bewitched you somehow, used her proximity to what?" Adrian's interruption was swift and brutal. "To show me kindness without expectation of reward, to demonstrate courage in the face of genuine danger, to possess a nobility of spirit that makes this room's petty machinations look like the sordid grasping they truly are." He turned back to Celeste, his expression softening completely as he took her hands again. "I know my proposal comes in circumstances you could never have imagined. I know the obstacles before us seem impossible, but I also know that I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Celeste's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she looked up at this extraordinary man who had turned his entire world upside down for her. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, I love you more than I ever thought possible to love anyone. But I cannot let you sacrifice everything for me." "Sacrifice?" Adrian's smile was the first genuine expression of joy anyone in the room had seen from him. "Celeste, choosing you isn't sacrifice. It's salvation. You've shown me what it means to be truly alive." Before she could protest further, he dropped to one knee before her, producing from his coat pocket a ring that took everyone's breath away. It was not the ostentatious display piece one might expect from a royal engagement, but something far more precious, a delicate band of white gold holding a single perfect emerald, clearly an heirloom of extraordinary value and meaning. "This was my grandmother's ring," Adrian said softly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "She was not born to nobility either. She was a painter's daughter, whom my grandfather met in a village much like this one. Their marriage scandalized society, but it was the truest love story our family has ever known." The revelation sent another ripple of shock through the assembled guests. Royal history was being rewritten before their eyes. "Celeste Whitmore," Adrian continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "will you marry me? Will you let me spend my life proving worthy of the gift you've given me?" The silence stretched for an eternity. Then, with tears streaming down her face, Celeste whispered, "Yes." The word seemed to transform everything. As Adrian slipped the emerald ring onto her trembling finger, the reality of what had just occurred began to settle over the room. A prince of the realm had just become engaged to a servant, in defiance of every social convention and expectation. Lady Margaret made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "Your Grace, even if you persist in this madness, you must understand that the girl's family debts remain. They are legally binding obligations that will be settled in full within the week," Adrian said calmly, rising and drawing Celeste to his side, "along with compensation for years of exploitation and fraud. I trust my solicitors will find the Ashford family's record-keeping enlightening when they conduct their audit." The threat was unmistakable. Lady Margaret's face went ashen as she realized that her years of creative bookkeeping and inflated charges were about to be exposed to legal scrutiny. "Furthermore," Adrian continued relentlessly, "I believe Miss Whitmore's brother and his family will find the cottage they currently occupy somewhat inadequate for their needs. Arrangements will be made for more suitable accommodations on Crown land." With a few carefully chosen words, Adrian had just dismantled the entire structure of debt and obligation that had bound Celeste's family to the Ashfords for years. Lord Percival, recognizing complete defeat, attempted to salvage what little dignity remained. "Your Grace, if you are truly determined on this course, perhaps we could discuss arrangements that might benefit all parties." The suggestion of a financial settlement hung in the air, but Adrian's response was swift and final. "The only arrangement, Lord Percival, is this. Miss Whitmore will no longer be employed at Thornwick Manor. Her final wages will be paid in full, with a generous bonus for years of faithful service. Any suggestion that she owes this estate anything further will be considered a personal insult to the Crown." As the implications of Adrian's words sank in, the assembled guests began to realize they were witnessing history. Not just the scandal of a royal engagement to a commoner, but the complete destruction of one of Cornwall's most powerful families and the elevation of its most humble member to the highest ranks of society. Lady Evangeline gathered the shreds of her dignity and swept toward the door. "Congratulations, Your Grace," she said with icy formality. "I'm sure you'll be very happy with your choice." As she departed with her retinue, other guests began making their hurried farewells, eager to spread the news, but equally eager to distance themselves from the Ashford family's fall from grace. Soon, only Adrian and Celeste remained in the drawing room, surrounded by the debris of shattered crystal and abandoned social conventions. In the silence, they could hear Lady Margaret's hysterical weeping from somewhere deep in the manor. "Are you certain?" Celeste asked quietly, still struggling to believe that any of this was real. "Are you truly certain you want this? Want me?" Adrian cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I have never been certain of anything else," he said firmly. "You are my heart, Celeste, my soul, my future." As he bent to kiss her for the first time, the storm that had been raging outside finally began to clear, and the first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing them in golden light. The revolution was complete. 2 years later, Blackthorn Castle stood transformed, its ancient stones warmed by laughter and love in a way they hadn't experienced for generations. Princess Celeste Blackthorn, formerly Miss Whitmore of no particular consequence, stood in the magnificent library watching her husband read correspondence from their estate managers. The emerald ring on her finger caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, casting dancing reflections on the leather-bound volumes that surrounded them. She still sometimes found herself staring at it in wonder, remembering that terrifying, beautiful night when her entire world had changed forever. "The harvest reports are excellent this year," Adrian said, looking up from his papers with a smile that never failed to make her heart skip. "The new farming methods you suggested have increased yields by nearly 30% across our Cornwall holdings." Celeste moved to perch on the arm of his chair, automatically straightening his collar in the affectionate gesture that had become second nature. "The tenant farmers deserve the credit. They were willing to try new approaches when they realized we actually cared about their welfare rather than merely extracting every possible penny." The transformation of the Blackthorn estates had been one of their first joint projects as a married couple. Hadrian had been horrified to discover the conditions under which many of his tenants lived, and Celeste's intimate understanding of poverty had guided their reform efforts. Fair rents, improved housing, schools for the children, and medical care for all had revolutionized life across their vast holdings. "Speaking of Cornwall," Adrian continued, his eyes twinkling with mischief, "I received an interesting letter from our solicitors regarding the Ashford estate." "Oh?" Celeste tried to sound casual, but she couldn't entirely hide her interest in the fate of her former tormentors. "It seems Lord Percival has been forced to sell Thornwick Manor to cover his gambling debts. Lady Margaret has taken a position as a companion to an elderly widow in Yorkshire. A rather demanding position, I'm told, with very strict rules about proper behavior." Celeste felt a complex mixture of emotions. She bore no hatred for her former mistress, but she couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in seeing justice done. And Lady Evangeline? Married a wealthy merchant from Birmingham. Not the royal connection she craved, but a good match nonetheless. I'm told she speaks of her brief acquaintance with us as a narrow escape from a most unsuitable alliance. They shared a smile at that. The scandal of their marriage had rocked society for months, but time and Adrian's unwavering devotion had slowly won over even the most skeptical observers. Celeste's natural grace and genuine kindness had made her beloved among the common people, while her intelligence and compassion had gradually earned the respect of the nobility. Your Grace, The excited voice belonged to Tommy, Celeste's younger brother, now 15 and serving as a page at the castle while receiving the education that had once seemed impossible for a fisherman's son. "The carriages are approaching." Celeste and Adrian exchanged knowing looks. Today marked the arrival of several important guests for their second wedding anniversary celebration, including Celeste's closest friend from her servant days, Mary, who had married the castle's head groom and now managed the household staff with impressive efficiency. As they made their way to the grand entrance hall, Celeste reflected on the incredible changes 2 years had brought. The terrified, desperate girl who had once scrubbed floors at Thornwick Manor could never have imagined standing in her own castle, preparing to welcome guests as a princess of the realm. The first carriage contained Mary and her new baby, a robust little boy whose christening would take place the following day, with Adrian and Celeste as godparents. Behind them came a procession of local dignitaries, reformed former adversaries and new friends, a carefully curated guest list that reflected the couple's commitment to bridging the gap between classes. "Princess Celeste!" Mary's greeting was warm and unaffected, despite her friend's elevated status. The two young women embraced with genuine affection, their friendship having only strengthened through the extraordinary changes in their circumstances. "You look wonderful," Celeste said, admiring Mary's improved complexion and fashionable dress. "Marriage and motherhood agree with you." "As marriage agrees with you," Mary replied, her eyes taking in Celeste's radiant appearance. "I've never seen you look so happy." It was true. The constant fear and anxiety that had once shadowed Celeste's every moment had been replaced by a deep contentment and joy. Adrian's love had healed wounds she hadn't even realized she carried, while their shared purpose in improving life for others had given her a sense of meaning she had never dared hope for. That evening's celebration was everything a royal anniversary should be, elegant, memorable, and touched with genuine warmth. The great hall blazed with candlelight and flowers, while musicians played melodies that spoke of love triumphant over adversity. Adrian and Celeste opened the dancing with a waltz that reminded everyone present of the fairy tale nature of their romance. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Adrian rose to address their guests, his hand reaching automatically for Celeste's as he spoke. "2 years ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I came to Cornwall believing I understood my duty, my destiny, and my limitations. I was wrong on all counts." His gaze found Celeste's, and the love in his eyes was so profound that several ladies in the audience sighed audibly. "My wife taught me that true duty lies not in maintaining tradition for its own sake, but in using our privileges to lift others up. She showed me that destiny is not something imposed upon us, but something we create through our choices and actions. And she proved that the only real limitations are those we place upon ourselves." He raised his glass and every person in the hall followed suit. "To Princess Celeste," he said softly, "who saved not just my life, but my soul, and to the truth that love recognizes no barriers, not of class or wealth or birth, when hearts are truly meant to be together." The toast that followed was thunderous, but Celeste heard none of it. She was lost in Adrian's eyes, remembering a stormy day when a desperate prince had ridden too close to a cliff's edge, and a poor servant girl had found the courage to call out a warning. From such small acts of bravery, the greatest love stories were born. Later, as they stood together on their private balcony, overlooking the moonlit sea, Adrian wrapped his arms around Celeste from behind, resting his chin on top of her golden head. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving up the life that was planned for you?" Adrian's arms tightened around her. "How could I regret gaining everything I never knew I wanted? You are my greatest adventure, Celeste, my greatest joy, my greatest love." In the distance, waves crashed against the very cliffs where they had first met, their rhythm as eternal as the love that had transformed them both from lonely, duty-bound individuals into something infinitely greater together. The sea that had once threatened to divide them now sang a lullaby of love triumphant, of barriers broken, and of two hearts that had found their way home to each other against all odds. And in the castle that now rang with laughter instead of loneliness, Prince Adrian and Princess Celeste Blackthorn began the 3rd year of their fairy tale, knowing that the best was yet to come. If you want more stories like this video and subscribe to support the channel.